I don't know about you guys, but when it gets late at night, sometimes I get tunnel vision. Welcome to History with Mr. E. Today we're talking about 23.2 Teddy Roosevelt and Domestic Affairs. In 1901, President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. He was Polish, or a Pole, I guess, as you would say, and an anarchist. He was murdered at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. And I think it was a great loss for our country because McKinley had brought us successfully through the Spanish American War. Industry had boomed under his presidency, and we were entering a great time for America. And honestly, it was kind of sad because he was a good president. He had chosen, and during his second term, the Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, who is one of the more colorful American presidents, to the point of he was almost a celebrity, more so than a president, especially after his 2 terms in office. McKinley was murdered, assassinated just a few months into his second term, so Teddy Roosevelt was sworn in at age 42, the youngest ever president. I think he was even younger than JFK later on down the road, and Barry Barnum, Barry Soetoro, President Obama later on. He was extremely popular as a public figure. If you remember, he had fought in the Spanish-American War and distinguished himself as a Rough Rider. And during San Juan Hill, he'd become a national hero. He had left office during that era. He was the Secretary of War and left office to go and fight. And then was, of course, later made vice president. But that was not the first time that he'd left political office. He had been a politician, I think, in New York. He was an outdoorsman and hunter. He was a sickly child. They told him to get outside and do stuff. So he became an outdoorsman and a hunter, started an exercise regimen, and it was just your basic man's man. He had a mustache that rivals many mustaches in history. Roosevelt was so popular that the press would follow him around on hunts. And one time, some of his colleagues on a hunting trip had tied a bear to a tree because they were getting frustrated that he couldn't find a bear to shoot. Because, hunting means going out in the woods and killing everything that crawls, apparently. And they tied this young bear cub to a tree for him to shoot, and he wouldn't kill it. He had them untie it and let it go. And after that, the press took hold of that story, and they began to name bear dolls teddy bears after Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt was, Harvard graduate, just a brilliant man, mind, just a dynamic personality in American history. On the same day, which I don't remember the date, his wife passed away and his mother passed away, and he left politics for the first time. This was the first time. The second time was during the Spanish-American War, so he could go fight. And he became a cowboy and a rancher in North Dakota, and did well at that, but eventually went back to politics in 1886. He was a U.S. Service Commissioner in 1889, and was the president of the board of the Police Commission in New York from 95 to 97, Secretary of the Navy eventually, which is actually, he wasn't Secretary of War during the beginning of the Spanish-American War, but Secretary of the Navy, that's when he quit to join the Rough Riders. Then he became governor of New York and vice president under McKinley. Teddy Roosevelt did 4 major things during his years, domestically, 4 major things. He expanded the powers of the president. This is the beginning of the progressive era. He expanded the powers of the president. He was known for honesty in business. He broke apart over 40 major corporations and forced them, he busted trusts and forced them to break apart to help American business and increase competition and fair pricing. He worked hard to conserve the natural resources of America, places like Mammoth Cave and Yosemite National Park and things like that, where the conservation effort started really with Teddy Roosevelt. And he worked hard to make a square deal for all Americans so that every American could prosper, not just the rich ones. And that was a great thing. And it started the progressive era in America. The progressives worked hard to change the U.S. political system. They opposed the corruption and inefficiency that had ruled the bureaucracy for several years in America. Remember, we had already lost a president because he hadn't given a political appointment to the man that murdered him. I can't remember if that's Cleveland or Garfield. I'm pretty sure it was Cleveland because Garfield was the one who had 2 non-consecutive terms and ate a lot of lasagna. But I digress. The progressives worked hard to oppose corruption and inefficiency in the government. They understood what voters wanted. They weren't just politicians sitting on a throne somewhere. They really understood what the voters wanted, and they were popular people. They considered themselves populists. They believed that government intervention in almost every aspect of American life could lead to political progress and prosperity for America. The earliest leader of the progressives was Robert La Follette. La Follette, also known as Badland Bob, and he fought, in his own words, for good government. The 3 presidents that made up the progressive era were Teddy Roosevelt, who we're talking about today, William Howard Taft, who succeeded Roosevelt, and then Woodrow Wilson, who succeeded Taft. Obviously, because they're all one era, one had to succeed the other. You couldn't have let's just stop in the middle and have a different president who wasn't a progressive. It didn't happen like that, obviously, and I think I'm starting to ramble. In business and labor, Teddy Roosevelt worked hard to make a fair deal for everybody. No one took advantage of the other was one of the things that he really pushed hard for. You couldn't have some massive corporation beating down the little man. He broke apart 40 plus business monopolies, especially the Northern Securities Company, Standard Oil, and the American Tobacco Company. He fought against big businesses or big business that was a threat to the public. He worked on having the government supervise these big businesses. There's something in my hair. Supervise these big businesses rather than letting these big businesses run wild. And that was necessary in that era. When these big businesses were growing, we needed those big businesses to grow, to bring prosperity and wealth to the United States. But now we needed to increase competition and fair business practices. They'd honestly gotten out of hand. He worked hard with the Elkins Act to make it illegal for shippers on railroads to accept a rebate, or for shippers to accept a rebate from a railroad to use that railroad. Basically, he tried hard to end shady business practices in America. He made it illegal for railroads to offer rebates for their funds, and they worked hard with the Interstate Commerce Commission to set pricing for shipping. I don't even know if that's legal in America today. I think that damages big business. It sounds to me more like socialism. Um, but the Elkins Act happened in 1903, and I wasn't alive to complain about it back then. He also set forth the Hepburn Act, which strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission even more, and established the Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903. They weathered a storm in 1907 that called the Panic of 1907, which was a loss of confidence in American banks, and he was able to negotiate reforms in big business that brought an end to that panic. Solidified our money once again. He worked hard to protect the American public. One big thing during this era, and a term that he coined, was muckraking or yellow journalism. We talked about yellow journalism when it came to the Spanish-American War, but muckraking was a term coined by Teddy Roosevelt and was taken from the Pilgrim's Progress. If you have any questions about that, please ask Trevor. It's one of his favorite books. But during this era, many journalists worked hard to write exposés on companies that they thought were taking advantage of the workers. Ida Tarbell wrote a history of the Standard Oil Company that was not kind. Lincoln Steffens wrote Shame of the Cities, which was a book that talked about corrupt politics in America. And the most famous and still used as a text in colleges, I remember when I was at Western, kids had to read it. I don't remember if it was for literature class or for a history class or for a business class or a journalism class, or whatever the heck it was for. But Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle, which was an expose in the disgusting, putrid meat processing practices in the meatpacking plants in Chicago. And this led directly to the formation of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, pushed through by Teddy Roosevelt. And if it was yellow journalism, if it was exaggerated or even false at times, well, so be it. It led to major and massive reform that makes our food healthier and safer to eat now. When it came to conservation, Roosevelt did some great things. 75% of U.S. virgin forest was gone by 1900. I think Paul Bunyan cut most of it down with one swoop of his axe. But Roosevelt noticed that we were destroying our country and our beautiful natural resources. So he started the National Conservation Commission in 1909 and added 150 million acres to our National Forest Reserve. He also added the New Lands Reclamation Act to help promote irrigation on the Great Plains in 1902. And he funded that from the sale of public lands. Irrigation was a massive problem in the Great Plains because there's not a lot of water feeding the Great Plains, and the weather patterns there are fairly arid. So irrigation really helped the Great Plains. Of course, it all fell apart during the Dust Bowl era that we'll talk about in a few weeks. But Roosevelt did some great things. I'd like to challenge you guys to look into what National Conservation Commission added in the way of national parks during the Teddy Roosevelt era. But that's all for today. I see the light at the end of the tunnel.